Hey, and welcome to another Space Engineers tutorial. This time, we're going to talk about thrusters. You can see the devastation around me, and that's because I tried a whole lot of different ways to test the power that thrusters have, and how many blocks they can lift, and they all ended somewhat poorly. Space Engineers physics not so reliable as it turns out. I tried to make a rig that could have each thruster type attached where we could find out how many different block types that could lift, but that went out the window when I ended up with a small hydrogen thruster that was lifting 12 refineries. Until I reloaded, of course, and at which point everything just exploded as it hit the ground. So, what useful tips do I have about how to design a ship in survival with the right number of thrusters? This time for the testing, we're not actually going to be in survival. In creative, we don't have to worry about fuel, so we'll take that element out of the picture and out of our calculations. Now let's get on to working out how many of these dang thrusters we need. How many do we need to build into our design so that we don't end up with something that's strapped to the ground when we're finished? And in survival, that's a bit more important because, unlike creative, it's a bit harder to add in those thrusters once you've got your armor on. So, my recommended approach is to build the core of the ship, like we did in the Large Ship Design series, and then try and lift the ship off the ground with just the core components in. So if we hop in the cockpit, and we bring our HUD back up, we can see that I've got all of our lifting thrusters off at present, and they're all listed along our hotbar. If we unlock the landing gear, and then activate these one at a time and see if we can lift off the ground, we'll find out how many of them are actually needed to lift. So we can lift the core of this ship with just 3 of our thrusters. That means we've got the thrust of 3 small hydrogen thrusters remaining in reserve for our armor blocks to be added. Now, that's all well and good, but how do we know how much armor we can add? That's where this weird looking line of ships comes in. Since there's so many different blocks in the game, I thought I'd just stick with light armor blocks for this demonstration, and hopefully that will be of use to you guys, at least when you're designing your industrial ships. When you're building your military ships, you're probably going to want more thrust than just enough. You're probably going to want an excessive amount, so armor shouldn't really be a problem, and how much thrust you have shouldn't be as much of an issue. So, what we have here is each individual type of thruster with close to the minimum number of support blocks that we'd require. So, thrusters in each direction, just smalls, enough power, and a gyroscope. In the case of a small atmospheric thruster, that is not enough to lift it off the ground. So we'll add another one, and then to find out the 0 point for where this can just barely lift, we hop in the cockpit, and with 2 of them, yep, we're just barely lifting, and that's with a nice 60 blocks of armor on top of it. I chose this testing method because all the other ones I tried, well, they did not work. Space Engineers has some odd physics when it comes to the interaction between gyroscopes, how much you can lift, and thrusters, and despite there being supposedly simple mathematical ways to work out how much we can lift, none of them really seem to work in a consistent manner when you are near that borderline of how much you can lift. So I also figured that if we visually have a demonstration of how many blocks we can put on, that might be useful, because realistically when we get up to these larger ones, that's a lot of blocks. We're probably not going to be counting them out. So having an idea in your head of, yeah, that looks like about that much, that looks like about 600 blocks, that'll be potentially useful. At least I think I'm going to find this useful for my future builds and hopefully have fewer that can't lift off the ground. So, we had our small atmospheric thruster and we had to add a second one and a whole bunch of blocks to balance it. So how much can one thruster lift if it doesn't have to lift the cockpit and all this other rubbish? Well, turns out that it can lift about 75 light armor blocks. In the case of the large atmospheric thruster, we can see it's got a whole lot more, and it can lift somewhere close to 800 light armor blocks. So if you've got a spare one of them, you should be able to clad a fairly sizable ship in light armor without having any troubles with lifting off the ground. And we can show that this one does still lift even with all that crazy amount on board, and could possibly take even a little bit more. But every time I tried to do that, half the time when I loaded the game, it would crash into the ground. So we're stuck with somewhere around 800. Now, that's good for atmospheric thrusters. Those things are actually quite powerful within atmosphere. Ion, on the other hand, is not. This thing, with a single ion thruster, doesn't move at all. We have to add another 6 extra lifting thrusters if we want small ion thrusters to be able to lift even the most basic of ships. And we can see, even with that many, it struggles to move. So, not your best atmospheric option. Saying that though, large ion thrusters, if you've got access to the platinum, which, unless you've made it up into space, you won't, they're actually not that bad. You could theoretically use them as a bit of support thrust while you're in atmosphere, because a large ion thruster manages to lift about 160 blocks of light armor per large ion thruster, which isn't a lot when you compare it to the 800 of the large atmospheric thruster, but it's still something decent. And then we move on to the real powerhouse of the bunch, hydrogen. These things can lift a lot. Even a small hydrogen thruster. This thing can lift about 170 blocks just with one extra hydrogen thruster. So that means the 3 extras that we have over on our Talisman ship from the large ship series, those 3 can add an extra, 3 times 170, that's 510 blocks. That's quite a lot of extra armor. So we'd be pretty safe to even cover that thing in armor more than I did. And then the big mama, the large hydrogen thruster. There is no way I would ever count out the number of blocks that this thing could carry as I'm building them. If I've got a spare one of these, I'm just going to go nuts. I'm going to add whatever armor I like, and pretty good chance it's going to be able to lift it, because the large hydrogen thruster can carry over 1,200 light armor blocks on its own. It lifts 600,000 or more kilograms of material at sea level. We can see that the weight of this ship is over 1.2 million kilograms, and it can still lift. Barely, but it can still lift. And that's with just 2 large hydrogen thrusters. If you've got the fuel, these things can produce a mountain of thrust. And then we move on to the small ships. These, you're probably less likely to need to look into this info, because it's often much easier to add extra thrusters to small ships, or at least the way I design them, it tends to be. So we'll just go through these in a very quick sense. With the small atmospheric thrusters, these can lift somewhere around 330 blocks, I think that works out to be, per atmospheric thruster. And the large ones, these can lift a stupid 1,400 small ship light armor blocks. Much like the large grid, the small grid ion thrusters are nigh on useless in atmosphere. And if we have a look, we actually need even more of them to be able to lift these things. That's 11 ion thrusters just to lift the most basic of ships. The large ion thrusters, again, sort of useful, can lift all of that, which is about 70 light armor blocks, plus the cockpit and all the other bits. So you could use that. It might work. If you pair those large ion thrusters with some atmospheric thrusters, you could probably get a decent ship going that would be capable of moving both in atmosphere and out, and potentially be able to transition between a planet and space without using any hydrogen at all. And then again, the hydrogen thrusters, these things are super powerful. Even with just 2 small hydrogen thrusters, you can lift all of this. And that means each hydrogen thruster on a small grid, and just the small ones, they can lift about 400 light armor blocks, or about 8,000 kilos each, which is pretty impressive. And then you got this ridiculous looking thing with this enormous cube that's got over 1,600 blocks, and it can still actually move reasonably well. So if you need power, hydrogen's your way to go if you can carry the fuel. If you're wanting to move around in atmosphere, you're not really going to be using small ion thrusters. Those things are worthless. Now, if we wanted to make any additions to a ship that we've already got, and we didn't have enough thrust on our core, it's a lot easier to add an extra thruster with the ship in this state. I can easily bring down an extra bit of conveyor from here and pop another hydrogen thruster on this side, pop another one equally on the other side. That's a lot easier to do than after we've got all of this on. I'd have to decide where I'm going to pluck it out from and then shape around it and redo a whole lot of stuff. Whereas if we figure it out at this point that we don't have enough lift to apply that armor, then it's a lot easier to fix it. So that's why I recommend building the core out, making sure it's functional, checking how many extra thrusters you have and how many you think you might need for your armor. And even once I've armored this ship, if we pop into the cockpit on this one, you can see there is actually enough thrust to have one of the thrusters not on, and it will still lift. Slowly, but it will still lift. So we could even add more to this and it would still technically be capable of lifting, but it's always nice to be able to lift just that little bit faster. So there you have it. A little bit of a guide on thrusters and a bit of a visual guide on how much they can carry. I will be putting this world up on the workshop if any of you actually want to take a look. But more importantly, in the description, I'll have the numbers of armor blocks per thruster and approximate weights that they can lift at sea level on a 1G world. That may be useful to you, particularly as when a ship is under construction, even if you don't have a cockpit, you can go to one of these control panels, click on it, go to your info screen and see your grid mass. That is accurate, and then you know how many thrusters you would need to lift that grid. In theory, anyway. There is a website that's from an older version of the game that might be helpful in terms of estimating your thruster numbers, but I'd still recommend going about building those thrusters onto the core part of your ship first, testing, use them as a bit of support, have a demonstration of how many blocks we can put on. That might be useful because realistically. So, we had our small, this other rubbish. Well, it can lift light armor blocks. In the case of the large atmospheric thruster, we can see it's got a whole lot more, and it can lift somewhere close to 800 light armor blocks. So if you've got a spare one of them, you should be able to clad a fairly sizable ship in light armor without having any troubles with lifting off the ground. And we can show that this one does still lift even with all that crazy amount on board, and could possibly take even a little bit more. But every time I tried to do that, half the time when I loaded the game, it would crash into the ground. So we're stuck with somewhere around 800. Now, that's good for atmospheric thrusters. Those things are actually quite powerful within atmosphere. Ion, on the other hand, is not. This thing with a single ion thruster doesn't move at all. We have to add another 6 extra lifting thrusters if we want small ion thrusters to be able to lift even the most basic of ships. We can see even with that many, it struggles to move. So, not your best atmospheric option. Saying that though, large ion thrusters, if you've got access to the platinum, which unless you've made it up into space, you won't, they're actually not that bad. You could theoretically use them as a bit of support thrust while you're in atmosphere, because a large ion thruster manages to lift about 160 blocks of light armor per large ion thruster, which isn't a lot when you compare it to the 800 of the large atmospheric thruster, but it's still something decent. And then we move on to the real powerhouse of the bunch, hydrogen. These things can lift a lot. Even a small hydrogen thruster. This thing can lift about 170 blocks just with one extra hydrogen thruster. So that means the 3 extras that we have over on our Talisman ship from the large ship series, those 3 can add an extra, what is it, 3 times 170, that's 510 blocks. That's quite a lot of extra armor, so we'd be pretty safe to even cover that thing in armor more than I did. Then the big mama, the large hydrogen thruster. There is no way I would ever count out the number of blocks that this thing could carry as I'm building them. If I've got to spare one of these, I'm just going to go nuts. I'm going to add whatever armor I like, and pretty good chance it's going to be able to lift it, because the large hydrogen thruster can carry over 1,200 light armor blocks on its own. It lifts 600,000 or more kilograms of material at sea level. We can see that the weight of this ship is over 1.2 million kilograms, and it can still lift. Barely, but it can still lift. And that's with just 2 large hydrogen thrusters. If you've got the fuel, these things can produce a mountain of thrust. And then we move on to the small ships. These, you're probably less likely to need to look into this info because it's often much easier to add extra thrusters to small ships, or at least the way I design them it tends to be. So we'll just go through these in a very quick sense. With the small atmospheric thrusters, these can lift somewhere around 330 blocks, I think that works out to be, per atmospheric thruster. And the large ones, these can lift a stupid 1,400 small ship light armor blocks. Much like the large grid, the small grid ion thrusters are nigh on useless in atmosphere. And if we have a look, we actually need even more of them to be able to lift these things. That's 11 ion thrusters just to lift the most basic of ships. The large ion thrusters, again, sort of useful. Can lift all of that, which is about 70 light armor blocks, plus the cockpit and all the other bits. So you could use that. It might work. If you pair those large ion thrusters with some atmospheric thrusters, you could probably get a decent ship going that would be capable of moving both in atmosphere and out, and potentially be able to transition between a planet and space without using any hydrogen at all. And then again, the hydrogen thrusters, these things are super powerful. Even with just 2 small hydrogen thrusters, you can lift hydrogen thrusters. That's quite a lot of extra armor. So we'd be pretty safe to even cover that thing in armor more than I did. Then the big mama, the large hydrogen thruster. There is no way I would ever count out the number of blocks that this thing could carry as I'm building them. If I've got to spare one of these, I'm just going to go nuts. I'm going to add whatever armor I like, and pretty good chance it's going to be able to lift it, because the large hydrogen thruster can carry over 1,200 light armor blocks on its own. It lifts 600,000 or more kilograms of material at sea level. We can see that the weight of this ship is over 1.2 million kilograms, and it can still lift. Barely, but it can still lift. And that's with just 2 large hydrogen thrusters. If you've got the fuel, these things can produce a mountain of thrust. And then we move on to the small ships. These, you're probably less likely to need to look into this info because it's often much easier to add extra thrusters to small ships, or at least the way I design them, it tends to be. So we'll just go through these in a very quick sense. With the small atmospheric thrusters, these can lift somewhere around 330 blocks, I think that works out to be, per atmospheric thruster. And the large ones, these can lift a stupid 1,400 small ship light armor blocks. Much like the large grid, the small grid ion thrusters are nigh on useless in atmosphere. And if we have a look, we actually need even more of them to be able to lift these things. That's 11 ion thrusters just to lift the most basic of ships. The large ion thrusters, again, sort of useful. Can lift all of that, which is about 70 light armor blocks, plus the cockpit and all the other bits. So you could use that. It might work. If you pair those large ion thrusters with some atmospheric thrusters, you could probably get a decent ship going that would be capable of moving both in atmosphere and out, and potentially be able to transition between a planet and space without using any hydrogen at all. And then again, the hydrogen thrusters, these things are super powerful. Even with just 2 small hydrogen thrusters, you can lift all of this. And that means each hydrogen thruster on a small grid, and just the small ones, they can lift about 400 light armor blocks, or about 8,000 kilos each, which is pretty impressive. And then you got this ridiculous looking thing with this enormous cube that's got over 1,600 blocks, and it can still actually move reasonably well. So if you need power, hydrogen's your way to go if you can carry the fuel. If you're wanting to move around in atmosphere, you're not really going to be using small ion thrusters. Those things are worthless. Now, if we wanted to make any additions to a ship that we've already got, and we didn't have enough thrust on our core, it's a lot easier to add an extra thruster with the ship in this state. I can easily bring down an extra bit of conveyor from here and pop another hydrogen thruster on this side, pop another one equally on the other side. That's a lot easier to do than after we've got all of this on. I'd have to decide where I'm going to pluck it out from and shape around it and redo a whole lot of stuff. Whereas if we figure it out at this point that we don't have enough lift to apply that armor, then it's a lot easier to fix it. So that's why I recommend building the core out, making sure it's functional, checking how many extra thrusters you have and how many you think you might need for your armor. And even once I've armored this ship, if we pop into the cockpit on this one, you can see there is actually enough thrust to have one of the thrusters not on, and it will still lift. Slowly, but it will still lift. So we could even add more to this and it would still technically be capable of lifting, but it's always nice to be able to lift just that little bit faster. So there you have it. A little bit of a guide on thrusters and a bit of a visual guide on how much they can carry. I will be putting this world up on the workshop if any of you actually want to take a look. But more importantly, in the description, I'll have the numbers of armor blocks per thruster and approximate weights that they can lift at sea level on a 1G world. That may be useful to you, particularly as when a ship is under construction, even if you don't have a cockpit, you can go to one of these control panels, click on it, go to your info screen, and see your grid mass. That is accurate, and then you know how many thrusters you would need to lift that grid. In theory, anyway. There is a website that's from an older version of the game that might be helpful in terms of estimating your thruster numbers, but I'd still recommend going about building those thrusters onto the core part of your ship first, testing them as we went through, just to make sure that you are actually going to be okay, because as we saw at the beginning, these things don't quite work out like we expect. There's still more tutorials to come, so I'll see you then.
Acknowledgements across the table as the hungry, rugged tomb takers kind of try their best at giving pleasantries.
As guests, do you lot want to say grace?
Y'all look at each other. Otis goes, no.
It's tradition. Say a blessing for the food, you know, based on the being that you worship.
The guest always says the grace.
Looks around at the other ones and Lucian goes, that was good. The eyes kind of go black for a second. Then,
Amen.
Was that Otis?
that was Otis the
What
halfling.
language? Do we know what language that was?
God was that?
You don't know.
Oh shit!
I speak Sylvan, Giant, Elvish, and Common.
Giant? Then no, you do not.
Abyssal and
I
celestial?
speak
Nope.
infernal.
Celestial.
Nope.
Goblin.
Deep
Nope.
speech.
Deep speed.
What the
And
fuck
you
did he
understand
say?
everything now. This is right.
That's true. And I
Everything.
can understand spoken tongues.
Yeah.
Tongues.
Yeah, you
Anything
can.
Yeah, I need to
spoken.
fucking remember that.
So you make out that the gist of this was, "O great distant voice, come upon this meal and let us destroy and devour of its sustenance."
You just see Bo just like zone out and then slowly eat. Yeah.
Okay. They all go into their feasting and the quiet persistence of.
Oh, I call my cat over. Lisa, could you do me a favor and go to the back and get just one plate of zucchini muffins, and also some banana nut bread ones as well.
Those little bugs.
Yeah, we have those are permanent now as well. So more bugs for the lady.
Never mind, lethal. We have enough.
Ooh, have you ever tried yogurt-covered bugs?
No.
You should do. Let's try those.
Lethal. Can we get like a little thing of yogurt?
No, not like yogurt-dipped bugs. Like yogurt-covered bugs. You know, like yogurt-covered raisins.
Oh,
Yes,
like a
yes.
hard yogurt? Okay,
Confection.
so take some of the bugs, dip them in, and then put them in the fridge, the cold box.
You know how to do it.
And then
Yogurt-covered
they'll
bugs.
harden, and then it'll be like a little.
Ford, would you like to order anything specific?
The cat's head slowly turns towards Caleb and just looks at him for a second, looks back and goes,
Lethal's a bitch.
Technically, yes.
I like him.
What's your favorite kind of food, Lucian?
Well, to be honest, whatever's warm and I didn't have to pay for.
No, you have to have like a favorite. That's a boring answer. What's your favorite food?
Agree with that.
Things with, I don't know, spiced cream. I grew up eating bland food, anything that's interesting, and
Where did you grow up? Where did all of you grow up? What were your lives before this?
you see them all kind of look uncomfortable and be like,
Super culty.
I don't know if this is about sharing personal histories per se. I grew up in Shady Creek Run.
All right.
That's about as much as I'd like to talk about it.
Inside.
Make an insight.
22.
Seems pretty straightforward and pretty much does not want to talk about it.
Shady Creek Run. Is that near where Mollymock was?
That's where we fought Lorenzo.
That's sort of interesting. That's interesting, isn't it?
It's where we met Keg.
Well, that's less interesting to Lucian, but it's interesting. It's just interesting.
Hey guys and gals, Malkuth Night. Hello there, and as usual, I'm Aaron from My Staying Gamers, and welcome. So today is Thursday, and like I used to say, we've got an exciting new update. Now recently it's been a lot of bug fixes, but finally we've actually had some new features as well as the bug fixes, and it's extremely exciting. We've got hydrogen thrusters, we've got hydrogen tanks, we have new doors, batteries that have been reworked, and we even got pet snakes. So first off, I'll start with the little snakes here. Now these roam the floor of your station, eating small, no I'm just joking, they're not pet snakes. These are actually superconductors, and they're an extra element that they've added in to produce jump drives and other advanced pieces of equipment. So it's just another way of balancing out the game. Now behind them we actually have the hydrogen tanks, and the hydrogen tanks work by taking ice. So over here we've got an oxygen generator. This produces both oxygen and hydrogen. It'll siphon it off into the tanks, and you can see it fills it up much like a battery. And this hydrogen at the moment can actually be used to power the rockets. Now I don't know if in the future it'll be used to power anything else, but at the moment we've got these hydrogen fueled rockets, and I'll actually stick one on top of the hydrogen tank to see how it works. So pay attention that we've actually got the rocket actually lit, and it's using the fuel from the tank below. And over here, since it's not connected up to any hydrogen, it's just placed on the floor, that the rocket is not actually firing. Ooh, look at that. Can we go all the way in it? No, we can't. It's just stuck hovering above. But still very cool. Now let's actually have a talk about the hydrogen tanks and oxygen bottles. So if you were worried about maybe you'd actually put an oxygen tank in your inventory or a hydrogen tank, you don't want to do that, that would cause a bit of problems. But this is the difference between the tanks. We've got the new model for the hydrogen tank, so we can actually fill up our smaller ships if you want to go out on an adventure, or you're going to build a small landing craft and you don't want to fill all its interior up with oxygen producing components. And then we've got the oxygen tank that we've seen there before. Now over to the batteries work a little bit differently. Now when you place a battery, it has 30% charge within the cells, but the balancing factor of this means that when you cut it and grind it back down, it turns to scrap metal, the actual cells that are in it. So if we grab ourselves a wood grinder for the component at the moment, and you can see we have the power cell. The power cell, when grounded down, will be a trade-off for that 30% of power. It will actually just be replaced with scrap metal. Now what's really cool about this is they've changed it the way it works. Now players really wanted to be able to recharge, charge and use the battery as it was charging up as well, so they've got this new semi-auto feature that we can actually tick here. So this will allow the battery to be used as well as the battery to be recharged at the same time. So that's a great new feature, especially for solar sail based ships. It allows you to use the power as well as charge from the solar sail. Now let's actually have a look at these thrusters in a little bit more detail. Now the thrusters on the side, you can see we've got 4 little ports on the side of this large small thruster. We also have the large one in the background, so we can vent in. We don't have to directly use the port that's on the bottom. We've also got the smaller variant. Now the smaller variant only has a port on the bottom, and there's the small little thruster, and that's only got the port once on the bottom again. But still, you can find many ways of connecting these things up. So now that we've looked at the basics of the hydrogen system, what we're going to do is take a look at the new door. Now you can see the new door here takes up the whole of the block, and it has these beautiful little windows. It also slides open. It reminds me really much of a hospital sort of door. It doesn't just slide to the side, it also rotates and pulls to the back. We can actually walk inside here. We can open this other door as well. Really useful for airlocks, I can see these being. There's a lot of space, you can fit a lot of people in them, and you don't have a load of people jamming through a door. And that's definitely one of the reasons why they redid these. I can actually fly through here quite easily, not get stuck at all, and close it up behind me. Just really slim, and it's just a beautiful door. To be honest though, it kind of doesn't have the same feel as a number of the other blocks, but at the same time, it is a very nice addition, and I'm glad they've added it. But let's have a look at some of the ships with the hydrogen thrusters. Now, to fit the hydrogen system into a smaller ship, I found it quite time consuming. It was quite tough to actually fit it in here as well. So what I've actually got is a hydrogen tank in there. Then behind that we've got a connector, and we've got the thruster block, although we've got a large thruster on the back. We've also got the oxygen producer at the front. Now that's quite a lot to fit in a small fighter ship, so I don't think it's going to be ideal for fighters. It's going to be primarily, I think, used for ships that need to go and land on a planet. You can hear the thrust. Just look at the acceleration. I'll put the hood on, and let's see how fast we can actually accelerate. Just look at that. That is quite a jerk of acceleration for a ship of this kind, so we'll slow down using the thrusters. They don't seem as maneuverable. Say, for instance, I turn to the left, the small thrusters have to account. Well, I guess you could account for that and build the ship a little bit differently. So let's actually hop out of that. We'll test the blue ship. Now, the hydrogen thrusters on the large ship just seem to have a maximum amount of acceleration. You'll see this thrust to weight ratio is incredible. So let's go 0 to 104 in pretty much. It's just done it. There we go. So we can actually accelerate back. It's going to be perfect for getting away from the strong gravitational pull of a planet, I can tell. Now let's actually fly back, see if we can actually stop. We can't stop because we're relying on that little thruster. We'll use the other thruster to back us off, and we'll just tap our way back. Now what I'm going to do now, I think, is some experimentation to see how much ice is required and how fast the hydrogen is used up by the actual thruster itself. We'll test that out, and we'll see exactly what we can do. So we've actually entered back into survival mode now, and we're going to test a few different things out. Now the first thing I want to test out is how long it actually takes to drain a full hydrogen tank. So we're actually going to start this quite quickly. We've actually got the time there, 22:57. I'm going to guess it's going to take more than a minute or so. We can actually see we've got an oxygen generator here, and to rule out any problems with that feeding it oxygen as we go, we're actually going to cut the pipe off, even though that system is off. So there we go, it's cut off, so that's not going to be feeding it any oxygen or hydrogen. So let's actually fire that thruster. So there we go, the thruster is fired, and it's already dropped down to what looks to be 3 bars. And it doesn't seem to be using any excess power than the usual reactor. The base is using a bit of power, but it's not using any excess, so that means it's purely burning hydrogen and not using any sort of power to burn that rocket. But that would be kind of expected. So there we go. We've not passed too much time. We're not even past a minute yet. We're down to 3 bars. Let's actually look into the menu, and we can see how fast it's burned in there as well. So hydrogen tank, and you can see fill at 81%. And it's dropping. It's not dropping incredibly fast. It looks like it's dropping about a second, every second or so. Well, but maybe about every 2 seconds we drop in a percentage. So this would last us a good few minutes by the look of it, maybe 4 or 5 minutes at full burn, and that's just with 1 thruster. Of course, if we increase the amount of thrusters, it'll decrease even less, so there we're down to 2 bars. So I've left it burning. We're going to empty this tank out before we actually restock it. We're down to 1 bar. Let's quickly check the menu to see how much percentage of hydrogen we have left. So we're down to 40% of hydrogen, and it's dropping still about that 2-1 second sort of interval, and it's not too long. Let's actually have a look at the difference on the clock. So it's been about 2 to 3 minutes at the moment, so we should be in the 5, 4, there we go. The hydrogen rocket has just cut itself out, and it's out of fuel. Very interesting. Now let's actually try refilling it through a pipe. So if we connect this up with a 7, so maybe we turn that off and we turn that one on to see if it refills. Okay, actually looks like we're getting some oxygen in there from the oxygen generator now. We put the stockpile on instead of the auto refill, and it is starting to build up very slowly though. So that amount of ice in there, let's see how much we've got down. So in total we had 10,000 ice, and we're already down to 5,000, and it started to feed it into the tank. But it's not doing too much of an impact, so it means we're going to have a lot of ice to build a lot of hydrogen by the look of it. Very interesting indeed. Let me just check the hydrogen tank again. Okay, we're only at 1.58%. Okay, so a lot of ice is going to be needed to fuel these rockets. So best of luck with that. Now moving on to this week's planetary teaser, that was not really showing too much except zooming out from the planet. Now it showed you how the trees slowly despawned away, but then the most interesting part as it sort of passed through the atmosphere was skipped, and this made me really wonder, how is the transition going to be between the atmosphere and the planet itself? You can notice the skip coming up here. There it goes, it transfers to there. What is that transition going to be like? How will you break into that planet's atmosphere? That'll be very interesting indeed. Anyway, I'll see you next time.
G'day and welcome to more Space Engineers Testing. Whenever I'm building a hydrogen ship, I often wonder, is it better to have a tank or is it better to have a generator? Am I going to get further by having huge amounts of ice in a generator or huge amounts of hydrogen already made up into tanks? I've thought of a few ways to look into this and test this comparison and see which one might work out best. But before we do that, let's have a look into how they might have some differences. First up, when you're thinking about ice versus hydrogen, cargo size makes an impact. The amount of hydrogen that's stored in a tank does not vary dependent upon your inventory setting. Times 1, times 3 or times 10 makes no difference at all. You will always get the same amount of hydrogen in there. That's not true of your oxygen generators. Right now I'm on times 10, so this small ship oxygen generator can hold 10,000 litres. But if I'm on realistic inventory settings, that's only going to hold 1,000. And that's not very much ice at all. That's a little over 2,000, 2,500-ish. You compare that to the hydrogen tank, which has been filled by the remainder of this ice. I placed 10,000 in here before, so that would mean it's going to take 8,866 units of ice, or litres of ice, to be able to fill a hydrogen tank no matter your inventory settings. That's a lot more than you can hold in the oxygen generator on realistic inventory. How about the large ship? Well, it holds quite a bit more. The large ship hydrogen tank takes, we started with 300,000 units in this case, so that's 276,836, if my maths is correct, which it might not be. That's a lot of ice. To give a bit of a demonstration of how much that is, if you needed to put that into small cargo containers on a large ship in realistic inventory, you're going to need 7 of them to fill that. And on a small ship, you're going to need an additional cargo container just for ice instead of having a hydrogen tank. That cargo container plus that ice is going to weigh more than the hydrogen tank. I think. I might just be guessing. So, on realistic inventory, you're probably going to want to have tanks. May be able to justify having a degree of oxygen generator and ice so that you can make it further distances if your tanks are big enough to make it up into orbit, where you can then provide minimal thrust and still use coasting to make long distance trips. Another thing I was interested in about hydrogen tanks and oxygen generators is with the hydrogen thrusters, do they use hydrogen while they're just idling? Which, yes, they do. They very much do. So if you're going to fly around and land, you definitely want to turn off your thrusters. I can prove this if we copy this ship, which has some hydrogen in its tank and its oxygen generators. Place that there. Now currently this thing is flying on atmospheric thrusters. We can actually switch to our inventory view. You can see that there's 4,000 units of ice in that oxygen generator and 4,000 in that one. If we keep our atmospheric thrusters on and turn on our hydrogen thrusters, we need to turn on our generators first, then take the ship down and land it, we'll be able to have an idea of how much, or if we use fuel when we're idling connected to a fixed object. And now that we're down, we can then lock to the ground, and we're now locked in place with no effort required from the thrusters. And you can see that the amount of ice here is still going down. Even though the ship is locked, those thrusters are doing nothing at all, of any use anyway. They're still using up our ice. So that's not so great. We've seen that idling thrusters need more fuel. Well, what about having more thrusters? Can you still generate the same amount of lift? So with the same two ships, we'll get a bit of altitude and then switch off our atmospheric thrusters, turn on our hydrogen thrusters, and see if these two ships can both climb at the same rate. Or even if they can climb at all. If you require a certain amount of fuel to go to each thruster for it to work, and you're then spreading that fuel out across multiple thrusters, can the oxygen generator actually keep up with all of those in a way that allows them to still function? And what I mean by this is the amount of fuel that's used per second by each thruster might overcome the amount of fuel that's generated per second by the oxygen generator. Turn them on. Turn on our hydrogen thrusters. Yep, they're all on. And then turn off our atmospheric thrusters and disconnect our merge block. 3, 2, 1, off, off. You can see that this one with just 2 thrusters, it's able to climb, it's able to hover. This one, however, it's struggling. Under the weight of all that fuel requirement, this just can't generate lift. I am trying my hardest right now and we're still going to crash into the ground. Oh, that's right, I'm in survival, I died. Oops. We'll respawn. Lucky that was there. What you can see from that test is that even if you have enough thrusters to generate lift, if your oxygen generator can't provide enough fuel flow, those thrusters are going to be nothing more than weights to drag your ship down. So if you're going to use oxygen generators alone to lift your ship, you're going to need to balance it properly so that you still have enough fuel flow. Now that we've looked at the thrusters a bit, let's go back to the question at hand, which is generators versus tanks. One upshot of tanks, I can see how much fuel I've got. This says I've got 36% of my maximum capacity. That's handy to know, and it's right there on my HUD. This one, however, says I've got 0, yet if we look in our generator, we have 100,000 units of ice. That's the exact same amount of fuel that's in this one. So that gives a significant advantage to the tanks in terms of ease of use. The other thing is that this tank can deliver enough flow of hydrogen to power many more thrusters than the oxygen generator can. So if we'd attached a tank to all of these millions of little thrusters, we possibly would have been able to keep that thing afloat without troubles. And you can demonstrate this relatively easily if we make these two ships the same by adding an oxygen generator to this one, which is empty, and then quickly turning this one off so it doesn't start filling the tank. Adding a tank to the top of this ship. So now both ships have exactly the same blocks. They have the exact same amount of ice on board. And if we turn off this tank, we can then demonstrate the difference in acceleration you can achieve by having full flow to your thrusters. Let's try with the slow one, the generator ship. We'll set our thrust override to maximum, which is 900 kilonewtons. We'll turn our thrusters, we'll unlock our landing gear, and then we'll turn our thrusters on. 3, 2, 1, go! What you're seeing is max override and 0 lift. If you look closely at the let's hop out. If you look closely at this override thruster, it's not even reaching the platform. It's not even damaging these blocks. Let's have a look at the one with the tank filled. Let's max this override. Let's unlock our landing gear. And let's power on our thrusters. 3, 2, 1, go. And you can see I can comfortably take off. That's because the amount of fuel that the tank can deliver per second is so much greater than the generator can deliver. And this means that we can comfortably fly something with a tank that cannot fly at all with just a generator. So the tanks do have big advantages. But there's one test where the generators might be able to win. And that is where they might be able to take you further if they can provide enough lift and if you're happy to not know how much fuel you've got left. Well, let's test this with large ships first, and we'll leave the final testing to small ships. Small ships is, I think, where the generators might have an upper hand, but only on high inventory settings. So let's test these small ships. What we have here is 3 pairs of ships. The first pair at the front here, they've had 20,000 units of ice in them. One of them's got it in its generator, one of them's got it in its tank. The only differences between these two ships is that, and this one has a tank, no generator, this one has a generator, no tank. And that's the same throughout. These two have 100,000 units of ice worth of fuel or ice, and these two have 400,000. Let's see how these comparisons go. What we're going to do is put our up thrusters on override. So we'll increase thrust override and decrease thrust override there. We're going to set this at 315 kilonewtons. I think that's enough for these to take off. We'll set the same on this one. Let's get our up group. Up. And then pop that on our toolbar. Something that's been brought up a lot of times and that I probably should have brought up when I was going through my tutorial on how to get to space is you can use these thrust override modifiers to be able to gradually adjust your power when pushing yourself up into space. It can make it a bit easier to get there without having to pulse press spacebar the whole time. So let's get on with the test. 20,000 units of ice. Unlock our landing gear. Turn on our thruster with 315 kilonewtons. Let's see how high we go. Probably half of our generator was on. And away we don't. More? Right. So, even with a fairly minimal ship, this thing can't take off. We do not have enough thrust from the fuel flow from our oxygen generator to even take off. Right. Well, if you've only got one generator, this is definitely not going to work. Let's turn off these thrusters. Let's add a second generator. I'm going to need to reset our fuel amount. So we'll leave 10,000 in that generator. And we'll put 10,000 in the other one. So we've got half the fuel in each. And let's see if that's enough to get us off the ground. Turn on our thrust, unlock our landing gear. There we go, 315. Let's see how high we go. What you can see here is that for every extra bit of thrust you need, you're going to have to add more generators. These generators will be fine if we're in space, because we don't need overwhelming acceleration. We can just handle a bit of dawdling and then gradually build up some speed, because we don't have to deal with gravity slowing us down or having to fight against it to even get off the ground. But on a planet, you're going to need that thrust, so you would need a lot of generators to lift a ship of any reasonable size. It's probably not practical. How high up have we gotten so far? We're at 4,000 meters, and how much fuel have we got left? Still got 7,000, so I've only used up a bit over 25%. It's not too bad. I'm leaving the thrust level so that we can make these tests roughly equal between the two ships, apart from the fact that this one has generators and the other one has tanks. And we'll compare how high each one goes once they run out of fuel. So we're at 10,000 meters, and how much fuel have we got left? Just under half. And we're at 20,000. How much do we have left now? Oh, we're almost out. 500. 300. Odd skipping ahead and not. And we're out of ice. At 22,000 meters we ran out of ice. How high will this carry us? We're not quite going to make it to orbit, but with enough fuel you could see that this would be feasible with something like this. 24,747. Alright. That's not too bad. Let's see if the tank can do any better. We'll use some of our creative tools and we'll teleport back down. Ooh. I should have turned my dampeners on. Whoops. Note to self, when teleporting, you maintain your current speed. So let's hop in our one with our hydrogen tank. Let's turn our thrust override up to 315 where it was on the other one. Let's unlock our landing gear. Let's shoot off into space. For this one, we'll just use our HUD and our 7% of fuel that remains. So we should get a bit of a better idea of how far we're going to go. These tests, I really struggled to think of ways to make it as equal as possible between the two options. But there are so many factors that impact on which one's going to perform best the number of thrusters you've got, the number of weight each block takes, the number of weight of ice you use. It might depend on how much ice you use. And it's going to depend on which grid size as well. So even if these tests aren't exactly equal or direct comparisons, hopefully the comparisons that I have been doing will be useful in terms of guiding what you're going to put on your ship. It looks like we might not make it quite so far into space. So it seems even with 2 generators, their mass doesn't quite make up for the mass of a large ship hydrogen tank. But I could be wrong. We're up to 14,000 meters now. We've got 3% of our fuel left, 2%. Might make it past that 23,747 mark with the generators made. But I'm suspicious it's not going to. The generators may still not be actually generating the full thrust that we've got set. Whereas the tank, it is going to provide that full thrust until the very last moment when it runs out. I stuffed up there, it was 24,747, but the result remains the same. Ooh, actually I might have called it too early. We've still got fuel left and we've cracked 20,000. Oh wow, I definitely called this too early. The tank is the victor. So even with all those other advantages on the side of the generators, because we need 2 of them, I suspect they actually do weigh more. Well, isn't that interesting? We've looked at large ships and although we didn't test all the weights, I think we can hand the victory over to the tanks. You need so much thrust to lift a large ship grid that the hydrogen generators, the oxygen generators, they really don't do enough. But on small ships you don't need quite so much thrust. So maybe over here is where the oxygen generators might shine. What we've got here is 6 different ships connected by merge blocks. The way we're going to run this test is to see which one can hover for the longest. And it'll be comparing each pair. All of these ships are identical, except for the fact that some of them have generators and some of them have tanks. This one has 1,000 units of ice, no tank. This one has 1,000 units of ice in hydrogen in its tank. 8,000, 8,000, 16,000, 16,000. All of them have 2 upwards thrusters, and all of them have a single gyroscope. All of our generators are on. Let's turn on our thrusters. Let's take off. We'll slide backwards a bit. And we'll watch our large ship crash behind us. And then we'll disconnect our merge blocks. 3, 2, 1, disconnect. Now we can see they're all disconnected. So they're all hovering under their own power. This one's going to be a bit of a waiting game. With each pair, I don't know which one of them is going to drop first. So this could end up quite interesting. This will be a test of how long they can provide enough fuel for. If we have a close look at the amount of thrust plume that's coming from each of these ships, you can see that this one's a bit smaller than this one. That suggests to me that the tank is heavier than the oxygen generator. It's the same with this pair, and it's the same with this pair. I don't know if that means that these are using significantly more fuel or not. Oh, we've lost our first tank. Okay, with 1,000 units, that puts the win onto this little gem here. Now, this is probably not ideal. Oh dear. That wasn't good. I'm not sure why that dropped. We'll just pretend that didn't happen. So, best out of 3, first has gone to the oxygen generators. I know this is probably going to have a negative impact on the validity of this test, but let's just bring this one back up. The advantage of this test is that each of the ships is only using the amount of thrust exactly required to keep it afloat. Unlike the test of trying to go up to the maximum altitude, where you'll be pushing against the speed ceiling, which should be impacted by the amount of mass you're pushing upwards, but might not be as accurate as this. So this is really a test of endurance, and a test of endurance versus the mass difference. So this should give the biggest possible advantage to the generators. As they use up more fuel, they become lighter, which means they need less fuel to keep themselves aloft. Oh, there we go. We lost another contender. That is 2 for the generators, none for the tanks when it comes to small ships. Large ships, tanks still win, but small ships, generators have an upside. They do last longer. So on a small ship with high inventory settings, you're probably going to be better off with a generator. Let's see if that still holds true with really high amounts of ice though. Looking at those exhaust plumes from those 2 hydrogen thrusters, I'd say yes. Yes, it does have an advantage. I reckon we're going to lose that double tanked ship well before we lose the other one. Interestingly, will we lose the one that had half as much fuel before we lose the double tank one? Ah, disappointing. It didn't quite beat out this one. How much fuel does this have left? 16%. Having started off with 90. Can the tanks pull out a last minute victory here? We've still got... Oh, no, they definitely can't. We still have over 8,000 units of ice. We've still got more than half the ice left in this ship that it started with. Whereas this one, these tanks started at close to 90% full, and they've now got 12% left. I think we can easily call the victory to the generators for small grids. One thing, if you're wondering why I didn't test these 2, that's because they have a huge amount of ice, and if we put this extra generator on board, not like that, like that, and we fill it with as much ice as it can take, excellent. Make sure this generator's turned on. Don't worry, we'll see those explode. We hop in, turn on our thrusters, unlock our landing gear. With this much weight of ice, we can't take off. However, with the same amount of ice in a tank, or in 2 tanks, turn on our thrusters, turn off our landing gear, we can take off comfortably. We can fly around, and to me, that comfortably hands the large ship victory to the tanks, because they are just simply so much more practical. Head back over here. 4% of our fuel left. And how much in ours? Still just under half. What we've seen here is that dependent on the size of your grid, dependent on the inventory settings you're playing, and dependent on where you want to go, whether it's in space or whether you have to move around on a planet, you're going to want to consider what's best for you and what's best for what you're trying to do. There will be situations where tanks are better. There will be situations where generators are better. There will be situations where a mix of the 2 is better. But if you just want a small ship and you just want to get to space, you really can't go past generators. These will take you so much further and get you there and back. as long as they can actually get you off the ground and you don't need 20 thrusters to do that. If you want to make something tiny, stick with a generator. You might even be able to fit a few more of them, depending on the shape of your vessel, than you would be able to fit one of the tanks, because the tanks are a bit cumbersome and a bit awkward to fit. If you've got any suggestions on further tests we should do to compare these two, or other things you'd like to see compared, please let me know. As always, there's plenty more to come, so I'll see you then. G'day and welcome to another Space Engineers tutorial. Today we're getting bombarded by meteors, and it's all because I wanted to see just how much platinum you would need in order to get to space without using a single little bit of hydrogen. What we've got here is a tiny little deposit of platinum that came down via a meteor strike. And I wanted to see how much platinum we would get out of this, and if it's enough for us to get all the way up into space. Looks like I've got it all, and that's a total of 615. Now, that's not always how much you get, but in my testing so far, I've gotten at least 300 each time I've dug up one of these deposits. So, let's load up a game where we don't have meteor strikes killing my performance. And then we'll see if we can make it all the way to space. So now that we've gotten lucky, we've gotten a small amount of platinum from a meteor strike. Now we want to figure out if we can actually make it up to space. But first, we should probably look at how much platinum is required in order to make thruster components. On full realistic settings, which is what I've got set at the moment, a single thruster component is going to need 0.4 platinum ingots. To make those, on a refinery with no upgrade modules, you're going to need far less than what I managed to collect on any of my deposits. You will actually only need 99 kilograms. On a refinery with full yield modules, you will end up needing half that. So if we move that there and move across 49.5, once we come back to these, you'll see that there will be 0.4 kilograms or 400 grams of platinum ingots in each of these. Just enough to create one single thruster component. The good news with that is, when you're talking about small ship ion thrusters, they only need a single thruster component to be made. So if you could get to space with a single thruster component, or a single ion thruster, you won't need anything else. And turns out that's actually possible. So we'll start by placing down a small landing gear. Then place a remote. Then we'll place a reactor on that. Gyro on the front. We need one atmospheric thruster for lift. And a single ion thruster for once the atmospheric can no longer lift us anymore. Then on top, all we need to do is turn on our inertial dampeners so I can actually fly, because that was getting really awkward. Pop this seat on the front. We're going to need some uranium, and because I've activated creative mode, let's grab some uranium ingots. And that's with the Shift F10 menu. I should also, since I've got no oxygen on me at the moment, spawn in an oxygen bottle. Hopefully these spawn full. I actually can't remember.
Inventory full.
They do not. Oh. I'll be back in a sec once I get my oxygen. Now that I've got oxygen again, let's see if we can make it up to space.
No.
Let's hop in our chair. They're a very odd looking craft. It's going to be very difficult to fly, but as long as we make sure we stay fairly vertical, we should be okay. And if we do get sideways, it might get ugly, but it should be okay. And it might be a bit difficult to land on the way back down. But this thing will work. Ready to launch in 3, 2, 1, launch. And the landing gear locked again. There we go, that's better. And away we go. It's not going to be the safest thing for me to do this with my helmet open, so let's close that. And then we'll zoom, zoom, zoom all the way up. Conveniently, that GPS marker is pretty much directly beneath me, so we'll be able to see just at what point the atmospheric thruster cuts out and the point where the ion thruster starts working for us.
Inventory
As we should see a dip in our speed, but if we're going fast enough, we'll actually carry all the way through that slowdown zone and be able to continue on once, basically slingshotting ourselves across the zone where the two thrusters aren't quite working well enough to keep us aloft. So we are already 8 kilometers up. I think this may actually be light. Oh no, we're slowing down a little bit now at 8.7. Will we start accelerating again? We've got 0.73 G's of gravity. Still slowing down, 82, 81, 80. We're almost 10 kilometers up. Are we going to start accelerating again? 72, 71. I think we might be starting to get a little bit of juice out of that ion thruster. Yep. And we're clean through the dead zone. Now it's a straight run all the way to space. We're accelerating and we're good to go. So as it turns out, if you want to travel to space with a contraption like this, you only need the tiniest amount of platinum to do it. It's not the most practical way of doing things though. So what if you've built an atmospheric ship and you want to work out how many ion thrusters you need to add to it to make it be able to travel across all zones of space without having to add a full hydrogen system to the ship, as that can be a bit more challenging design-wise, whereas adding a few ion thrusters might be a little bit more doable. As you can see, we're now 16 kilometers up. We're at full bore. That atmospheric thruster is doing nothing, and we are not decelerating. So, apart from the stopping problems, this makes it to space. So let's jump to our other testing platforms and start looking at what we can do to work out how many thrusters we need to get a ready-built ship all the way into space. A significant challenge of trying to work out how many ion thrusters you need for getting an atmospheric ship into space without using hydrogen is that the atmospheric thrusters lose their thrust somewhat gradually, and that means that the altitude they'll reach will be dependent on how much excess power you've got with your atmospheric thrusters. If you can just barely take off at sea level, then you're going to greatly struggle in getting a ship that's going to be powerful enough with ion thrusters in order to get to space. But if you're overpowered with your atmospherics, you'll, one, be able to slingshot really well, and two, you'll make it to a slightly higher altitude before your atmospherics are unable to counter the gravitational force on the vehicle. For for this little example, we've got 8 small atmospheric thrusters on a 20-ton ship, or thereabouts. And we can get up to just shy of 6 kilometers above sea level. So every bit of thrust we add by adding ion thrusters will be taking over from what the atmospherics are doing. So it seems like a reasonable point for us to run these tests from. And we try and find out how many ion thrusters we're going to need at this altitude to stay aloft. I'm suspecting it's going to be a few. So we've got 25 there. Let's shut off our atmospheric thrusters and see if we float. No, we do not. So 25 small ion thrusters is not enough to make it into space if we don't slingshot. How about 35? Okay, 35 can hold and 35 can accelerate. Let's start removing these and see at what point we start to fall. So with, how many does that end up being? So that's 31 thrusters. That's going to be the absolute maximum you need. Because remember, the atmospherics are still providing thrust at this altitude, even if the ions allow us to push them up a bit higher. 31 is providing all of the thrust with no atmospherics involved at all, and they are still functional at this level. But if we work off that minimum, we will definitely make it to space. And that minimum lift amount is about 750 kilograms based on this test. So if you want to make sure that you can definitely make it to space and make it back safely, you're going to work off roughly that amount. From my previous testing using all of these different thruster types at sea level, we know that the large ion thrusters are actually still reasonably effective in atmosphere, but not enough to keep this afloat. So a single one is not enough for the 20,000 kilograms. What about 2? Still not enough. Now if I start adding a bit of extra weight to try and work out a closer estimate of how much these can carry, up to 23 tons. So it probably is somewhere in the order of 7.5 tons or 7,500 kilograms that each of these large ion thrusters can manage to get across this dead zone without needing any help from the atmospheric thrusters. Those are going to be the most you need. You will be able to get away with less. And for a lot of ships, having just slightly more ion thrusters than you have atmospheric thrusters will work. For a lot of my smaller ship designs,